Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin, and this is the companion video for Roofline Cowl. Roofline Cowl was designed for 2024's N Club. It is the last design of 2024's N Club, and I'm absolutely thrilled with it. Roofline Cowl is 100% inspired by a photo I took of a row of rusty sheds in the Faroe Islands this summer. The angular lines of entrelac echo the shed structure, blending geometric elegance with cozy practicality. This cowl is warm without being bulky. The construction is new to me. It is a double-layered split cowl, and we'll go over the construction a little later in this video. Entrelac, I've actually never worked with entrelac before, and I came up with a way to use Lola's pickup line to avoid picking up stitches along the entrelac wedges. That is really fun, and I think it's going to blow your minds as much as it blew my mind while I was playing with it. So in this video, I'll be going over everything that you need to know to have success knitting roofline. We'll go over the materials that you need, working gauge, the construction of roof lines, and then how to work that entrelac with Lola's pickup line. I forgot to say that Roofline also has optional beads along the cast on of the entrelac, which was really fun to figure out. And then we'll end up talking about grafting the two halves together, some different modifications that you can do if you want your roofline to be a little different, and then talk about finishing roofline. It's important for me to remind you that we timestamp all of our videos. So if you are at a different point in the cowl and you need to watch that part of this video, you don't need to scrub through the whole thing. Just look in the video notes, click on the timestamp for the chapter that you want to watch, and jump right ahead to that. The other thing that's important for me to note is if you are a 2024 N Club member, you get to watch the unboxing video, which will tell you more about the yarn in the video. We have an interview with the dyer from Sea Change Fibers, Sarah, which is awesome. And it'll also tell you about the goodie that you got to make the furoshiki bag that Goldie is wearing behind me. So I'll make sure that you get links to that unboxing video as well. So let's jump right in and talk about materials first, and then we'll go ahead and talk about everything else. Okay, let's talk about what you need to have success knitting roofline. I used a sport weight yarn to knit my roofline. Sarah from Sea Change Fibers dyed two colors for us, inspired by that rusty shed photo that I sent her. And when I met her, I guess it was in spring of 2024 at H&H, I saw this base that she had that's a 50% merino Rambouillet. Rambouillet is a breed of merino sheep, 25% silk and 25% linen. This yarn is lovely. It's got the softness of merino and then that kind of gloss of the silk. And then the linen gives it this kind of heathered approach and a little bit of extra drape to it along with the silk. So you can see that it just falls beautifully when you're wearing it. The two colors that she dyed for us contrast each other. So they really pop and kind of vibrate against each other and get that idea of those like rusty roofs playing together. So this yarn is yummy. I think you're going to have a great time knitting with it. The other thing that you will need is beads if you want to bead the cast on of your roof lines. The beads that I used are a 4mm square Miyuki bead. I used beads in two different colors, and I chose a bead that contrasted with each color. So this greenish kind of turquoise bead goes on the rusty shed yarn, and then that bronze bead goes on the mineral shack yarn. So you'll want to choose the bead to string on that is the opposite color of the yarn so that they pop. If you string them on the same color, they're just going to disappear entirely. The beads are pre-strung, so you will need a dental floss threader or some other kind of tool for stringing the beads on your yarn. You will also need two pieces of maybe about 36 inches long of stitch saver. This is a 2mm stitch saver. If you're in the N Club, you have gotten two pieces in your kit kits. You got one in the last kit for Nostalgia, and then one more this time for Roofline. I will give you a link below to a blog post all about Stitch Saver if you don't know about it and want to learn all the magical things that you can do with Stitch Saver. What else do you need? A few other things will be helpful, like knitting needles. Let me just kind of clear this out of the way while I talk about the knitting needles because things get messy quickly. You will need two different lengths of circular knitting needles. The bulk of your roofline you will knit flat on a 36 inch. You could also use a 24 inch if that's what you have. The pattern calls for a US size 6 needle, which is a 4 millimeter needle to get gauge. You could, you'll work gauge and your needle size might go up or down from that. And then you'll also need a shorter circular needle that can be 16 inch, 20 inch, 24 inch might be a little bit too long to work in the round, but you'll need just those two needles and then a few stitch markers like 2-ish, 3-ish stitch markers. And finally, I think that a digital scale will also come in really handy, especially if you're trying to get the most out of your yarn. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the construction piece, and I'll give you a link to my favorite scale below if you don't have a digital scale. And then you'll need things like scissors and a tapestry needle, you know, the basics that you kind of always need when you're knitting a project. So those are the materials you're going to need. And once you have them gathered, it's time to wind your yarn and do a gauge swatch. So let's go ahead and talk about that next. Okay, gauge. I know you might say to me, Laura, why do I need to work a gauge swatch? It's just a cowl, it's going to fit. I always suggest that people work gauge for two reasons. One, you want your cowl to fit. You don't want it to end up being too small or too big. And though I've given you plenty of yarn in this kit and you're not going to run out in projects, if you don't have enough yarn, you're likely to run out. The fun thing is that if you are working with the same yarn that I use to work roofline, you can work your gauge swatch unblocked. You don't need to block it, which is fun because it's a little faster. You don't have to wait for it to dry. You can just knit a few cast on stitches, knit some rows, and then measure it. Since roofline is worked in garter stitch, that means that you are knitting every row, and I highly suggest that you work your gauge swatch in garter stitch. I do mention that. You'll work your gauge swatch. I would suggest casting on about 26 stitches and knitting, I would say at least 30 rows, and then lay that down flat and measure over 2 inches. You'll want to get at least 10 stitches and 18 rows to 2 inches, which is 20 stitches. Yeah, this is unblocked. 20 stitches to 36 rows unblocked over 4 inches. And this is all written into the pattern. I forgot to say that sometimes I say numbers wrong in patterns and in videos. See, I'm already doing it, but the pattern is always correct. So read along with your pattern as you are watching this. Sometimes I make mistakes. I try not to. So you can work your gauge swatch unblocked. If you're working with another yarn, that I do suggest that you block your swatch, and the gauge blocked is 22 stitches over 26 rows in 4 inches in garter stitch blocked. So that's a bit about gauge. Ask questions in the N Club group, we have an N Club group in Facebook, and then I'll set up a thread in our Ravelry group so you can ask a question in either of those if you have a question about gauge. If you have too many stitches per inch, like let's say you check your gauge unblocked and you have 26 stitches over 4 inches, then you're going to want to go up a needle size, which will make your stitches bigger. And conversely, if you have too few stitches over 4 inches, then you're going to want to go down a needle size, which will make your stitches smaller and give you more stitches per inch. That's a place that people sometimes get tripped up when they're working gauge. So you've got your gauge, and the next thing to do is do a bit of a deep dive into the construction of rooflines so you understand how it is knit, because I bet as you're looking at it on me, you're like, how is that working? What does that look like flat? So let's go ahead and look at that next. Okay, the construction of roofline is simple and yet it's interesting. And so underneath the camera here, I have a schematic of what is happening with Roofline, and I want to talk through it. Basically, Roofline is knit in two halves that are flat, and they're worked flat for almost the whole piece and then joined into the round for the last few inches. And then those two halves are grafted together in the round. So if you look at the schematic here, you'll see you're going to cast on the first half at the bottom border and work the entrelac bottom border. We're going to talk about entrelac in a bit. And then you'll transition to working just garter stitch flat. And then finally, you'll join that into the round, work in the round, and then put those first half stitches onto a holder and set them aside. And then you'll work a second half, and this is the construction schematic has you working this way. So you're going to cast on for the entrelac flat, and then work your garter transition flat, and then join into the round, work for a few inches, and then you'll have this point right here where you graft those two halves together. But you'll see that we have a split right here on each side of the garter round. And before you go to graft those two halves together, you're ensuring that the splits are on opposite sides of each other so that when you put on your cowl, those two flat halves pull away from each other to fit around your shoulders. It's really magical the way it just kind of comes together and becomes this lovely little shoulder hug without really like that much amazing shaping or detail for it to happen. Part of why it works so well is because of the drape of this fabric, because I have two layers of fabric right here, so it's quite warm and yummy around my neck. So this construction schematic should really help you. The other thing you're going to notice when you look at it is you'll see that I cast on over here with the mineral shack, and then I've got rusty shed, and on the top layer I cast on with the rusty shed, and then the second layer is mineral shack. And that is because you got two colors in your kit. One is color 1 and one is color 2. This is actually the first half of the cowl. You're knitting the bottom layer first. So I started with my color 1 being mineral shack and my color 2 being a rusty shed, and worked that half of the cowl and then set it aside. And when I went to work the second half, I switched and I made color 1 my rusty shed and color 2 my mineral shack. So if you want to knit this where the top layer has the blue, which is that mineral shack, then you would start the first half with rusty shed being your color 1. Ask questions if that didn't make sense. I left a note in the pattern explaining what I did so that you would understand that, but I think seeing it on me too really helps kind of clarify that piece. So that's a bit about color. If you want, if you're like, I don't need 2 layers of fabric, I live somewhere warmer, I would rather knit 2 cowls, you can certainly do that and knit a split neck cowl that has just the entrelac border, the garter transition bit flat, and then join into the round and knit a tube a little bit longer. So you could end up knitting 2 separate cowls that are like that, switching which is the C1 and which is the C2. So that's kind of a cool thing. If you're like, well, how much longer can I knit my cowl if I want to make my cowl a little bit bigger and taller when I join into the round, if I'm knitting 2 individual split neck cowls? The way to do that is when you knit the first half of the cowl, weigh your C1 and weigh your C2, and then knit the entrelac section and weigh your C1 and C2 to get again. The C2, so if I look, it's so hard to know like which side I'm looking at. The C2 right here on my first half was the rusty shed, right? So if I weighed my yarn beforehand and I worked the entrelac and I weighed my yarn again, I would know the weight for C2 that I need to make sure that I have for the second half. And that's going to be when I get to the blue right here. So if you're knitting that first half and you're like, I want to keep using my mineral shack and go all the way up in the neck and leave just enough to be able to do the second half, that weight for the C2 on this side is what you're going to need for working the entrelac in this section. Ask if you need more help with that. I promise it makes sense. I think it sounded like a lot of words to me as I was explaining that. The last thing to talk about is entrelac when we get into construction. In case you've never worked entrelac before, it's a really interesting, fun little stitch where you build these little modular squares or triangles in one direction, and then you come back in another direction and build off of them. So underneath the camera right here, I have a diagram of what the entrelac section looks like with the tiers. And I'm just going to grab my pen so I can draw with an arrow so you see what direction the tiers are going to be worked. So we're going to be casting on right at this point. And the first tier, tier 1, is triangles that are worked in this direction. So we're working all the way across. You are working, let's see, how many triangles are you working? You're working a total of 7 base triangles across, and then you are coming back and working your tier 2, and those wedges and triangles, they're actually triangles on the edge and squares in the middle, are worked in this direction. And then for tier 3, you're working back this way, and you got it. Tier 3 is very much like tier 1. You're working back in this direction, and you're continuing on like that for tier 4. And then finally, tier 5, because we need a flat edge for starting to work that garter transition, you'll actually be working German short rows to flatten off the triangles on the top of tier 5 so that you can just go into that straight garter stitch. So let's start to work that entrelac on our needles, because I think it's really going to start to make sense to you as we work it together. All right, let's get knitting. We're going to be starting with tier 1 and the left leaning base triangles. As I go through this video, it would be a very, very long, boring video if I knit the samples at the same size that you're knitting them on the cowl. So I'm going to be knitting fewer triangles and fewer squares, and my triangles are also going to have 5 stitches. Yours are going to have 11 stitches. So as you are knitting, though you'll hear me counting 5, make sure you are following your pattern, because you will be having 11 stitches in all of your triangles. As you get into this, it will make sense. I'll remind you of that a few times, and then I'll stop doing that because I think it'll drive us both crazy. But I think you're used to by now that I do things at a smaller scale than you. The first thing that you're going to do before you cast on is decide which is your C1 and which is your C2, which we talked about in the construction bit. And then you are going to string beads onto your yarn. You want to string on a bead that is the opposite color of your yarn. We talked about that in the materials section a little bit. I am working with the mineral shack, and so I have strung on my gold beads, which you can see really beautifully on my yarn. And if you've never strung beads onto yarn before, I will give you a link below to a video tutorial on how to do that. I know many of you have, so I'm not going to waste time with that here. Once you have those beads on your yarn, what you're going to do is with C1 and needle A, cast on 1 stitch. And all that means is you are going to make a slip knot and then put that slip knot onto your needle. Pretty easy, right? And now, turns out that I need 2 needles to do this portion. I'm going to go grab my second needle and also a piece of stitch saver. And I am going to K1B, which is knit one with a bead. So I am going to go into that one stitch on my needle, go down my yarn and grab a bead, and then wrap that yarn around and pull that bead through the stitch. And there you go. I have knit one with one bead. Also very easy. And now we are on row 2, which is a right side row. And the first thing that your pattern says is to wrap your working yarn around the stitch saver. And do you remember I said that I came up with a way to use Lola's pickup line so we didn't need to pick up stitches in the entrelock? This is the start of that. So I'm just going to take my piece of stitch saver, lay it over my working yarn, and then have my yarn ready to work a KFB, which is a knit into the front and the back of the stitch. This might be the hardest part of this pattern because you have so few stitches and you'll feel like that stitch saver wants to kind of move around. If you do that tightly, you'll see that everything's lined up and ready to go. And now I am going to turn my work to the wrong side. I'm on row 3 right now. I am going to knit one with a bead. That's that first stitch right there. I'm going to go down it. I'm actually going to bring up a few beads so that I don't have to keep going down my yarn so much. Wrap my yarn around. And then I am going to knit one. And now I am going to turn my work so that I am on the right side. And I am going to wrap my yarn around that stitch saver. And you'll see that stitch saver is just laying right over the yarn right there. So it wraps right around. And I'm going to knit one. And then when I KFB, I want to show you something. I am going to knit into the front and back of this stitch, but do you see how that bead is all the way to the back right there when I do that maneuver? If you do that every time you KFB, that bead ends up so beautifully right on the cast on edge. Isn't that slick? I'm so proud of that move. And now you're going to turn your work. You can start to feel a little bit of a rhythm to this knitting, I bet, already. And now I am going to knit one with a bead. And I am going to knit to the end of the row. And now I want to show you something that will make that wrapping your yarn around the stitch saver even easier. Although it is the first move on the next row that you wrap your yarn around that stitch saver, if you want, you can just bring your yarn to the front of the stitch saver right now so that when you go to turn your work and you bring your yarn to the back, it is already wrapped around the stitch saver. So you can kind of do that in one move instead of turning your work and then wrapping the yarn around the stitch saver. And now I am going to knit to the last stitch. And I am going to knit into the front and back of the stitch. And now if we look, you can see that I've got 3 beads right there along the cast on, and I have 3 wraps on my stitch saver. So those 2 numbers should always be the same as you're working this. All right, and now I am on a wrong side row. I am going to knit one with a bead, and I am going to knit to the end. This is row 7. Sometimes knitting is hard. And I am going to bring that yarn in front of the stitch saver so that then I can bring my yarn to the back. It's wrapped around the stitch saver. You will see these first 2 stitches I knit kind of tightly just to make sure that that wrap around the stitch saver is nice and tidy and tight. And now I am on a row 6 right here, and I've knit to the end and knit into the front and the back of that last stitch. And if I look, I've got 4 wraps on my stitch saver and 4 beads on that cast on edge. I'm going to do this one more time so that I have 5 and 5. So I'm going to knit with the bead, and then I am going to knit to the end right here. And then I am going to turn so I'm on the right side of my work, and you will see that I am on the last right side row right now. You're going to be working so that you end up having 11 beads on the bottom. I am working so that I have 5 beads on the bottom right there. And I am going to knit to that last stitch and then knit into the front and the back of this stitch. And we're going to stop and talk for a second before we move on to triangle 2. Okay, so there is my first triangle on my needles. You're going to see that I have 6 stitches on my needles, but I have 5 beads on the bottom and I have 5 wraps on my stitch saver. When you end right here, you're going to have 11 wraps on your stitch saver and 11 beads along the bottom, and you will have 12 stitches on your needle. That 12th stitch, or what for me is the 6th stitch, is going to become the first stitch of the next triangle of triangle 2. So let's go ahead and do that together. And sometimes when I get ready to work a triangle, I'll go and get the beads that I need for that triangle. So I know that each triangle that I'm doing works 5 beads. So I've kind of like moved up 5 beads. You can do the same thing where you go and grab 11 beads and then have the rest of the beads like down your yarn a little bit if you want. Okay, so now I am going to knit just 1 stitch with a bead and turn my work. This should be somewhat familiar. So I'm turning my work, and things will feel a little loosey-goosey on that, but you can do it, right? And now row 2 of triangle 2 has me wrapping my yarn around my stitch saver and working a KFB. And what I'm going to do is take that stitch saver I already have attached, pull it out a little bit, because I'm going to wrap around that same length of stitch saver. So you can see I've just pulled it up a little bit. And now I am going to knit into the front and back of that stitch right there. And you can see I'm starting that second triangle with that beaded cast on right there. And now I'm going to go ahead and knit one with a bead. If it helps you when you first get going with this, you can totally use bigger yarn, bigger needles, just play around and practice, use fewer stitches, and similar to me, work with 5 stitches just to get a feel for it before you cast on with your real yarn. So now I'm going to turn my work again. You can see I set up with the stitch saver as before, so I have that all wrapped around right there. And you're going to continue on with triangle 2, which has really worked just like triangle 1. You've just already kind of got that base and setup. When you are done with as many triangles as you're working, you are going to be working 7 triangles. I am going easy on myself, and I am working with 3 triangles. You're going to end up with something that looks like this craziness. So you can see this is my cast on stitch right here. This is my triangle 1. This is my triangle 2. This is my triangle 3. My triangle 1 and my triangle 2 have 5 stitches, and my triangle 3, when you end that, that's going to have 1 more stitch. So you'll have 12 stitches right there. I have 6 stitches right there. That stitch right there is worked as the first stitch of the next tier of tier 2, and we'll be working that with C2, which is the contrast color to this. So let's go ahead and do that in the next section. Okay, so we just took a little break to reset before I showed you tier two. And I asked Max, my husband, if it made sense to him. And his take was, well, I might need to watch that section one more time. So that's a reminder that this video is time stamped. So you can go back and watch things again if you get a little confused and you need a refresher, especially when you come to the second half and you're redoing these things again. It'll certainly be easier than the first round. So, do you remember me telling you that this is garter stitch entrelac, which means you would think that it means we're knitting every row? That is very true for tiers 1, 3, and 5, but tiers 2 and 4, because we are knitting back on the wrong side, working our first row of squares, we're going to be purling every row, and that is going to create the same garter stitch texture working from the wrong side. So right now I have my right side facing me of tier 1, and I'm going to turn that so the wrong side is facing me. By all means, if you get confused about which is your right side and which is your wrong side, you can place stitch markers to help you know which is your right side and which is your wrong side. And now I am going to grab my contrast color, which is C2. And right now to start, I'll be working a triangle that fills in the edge of the entrelac at the beginning of tier 2. So if you go ahead and look at that construction diagram on page 2, you'll see that tiers 2 and 4 have a little triangle up the edge and then squares in the center. So that is the first thing that I'm working. And my first maneuver is to work a knit 2 together. And this was the tidiest way that I found to do the transition of colors and tidy up that edge. So I'm knitting 2 together right there. And then I am turning my work again, and I'm going to work a purl front and back into that color 2 stitch. So I'm going to purl into the front and back of that stitch. At that point, you might look at that and say, oh my gosh, that's so messy. All you need to do is tug up your tails from your C1 and C2, and that will tidy that all right up there. So then you've got your 2 tails hanging there. At some point, once you know you're good to go, you can start to weave in ends. I would wait to do that in case you decide to rip things out or do things a little bit differently. And now I am on row 3, which is a wrong side row, and I'm going to purl 1, and then I'm going to purl 2 together. And at that point, I'm actually joining tier 1 and tier 2 with a purl 2 together. And then I am going to turn my work again, and I am going to purl 1, and then I'm going to purl into the front and back of this edge stitch. And then I am going to turn my work again, forgetting how to speak, get those tails out of the way to keep this as neat as possible. And now I am going to purl 2, and then I am going to purl 2 together. And I'm going to continue like this until I have eaten up all of those C1 stitches. So I'm just going to kind of work a little bit faster here to get to the end of this triangle so that we can work the first square together. Okay, I'm at the last join of the C1 and C2 stitches, that last purl 2 together. And I'm just going to work the final row 1 and 2, which so easy. They're just purl rows. And then that first triangle is complete. And then we got to start to play with some magic with that stitch saver. So I'm purling to the end and then purling to the end on this last row. And if you look at the color 2 stitches on my needle for tier 2, you will see that I have 5 stitches on my needle, and that is absolutely perfect because that is my magic number. Your magic number is 11, and you will have 11 stitches on your needle. And now we're going to go on to the first right-leaning square. You have 6 of those squares total that you will be working. We're going to work the first one together, and then I'm going to show you what happens when you work the right-leaning triangle on the other edge of tier 2. So, do you see how I'm holding on to my stitch saver? Because I'm so excited. The setup row says, on the wrong side, slide your 11 C1 wraps onto the right-hand needle. So let's go ahead and do that together. I am going to jab this stitch saver onto my needle right there, and then I'm going to pull that stitch saver out and then slide those 5 wraps onto my needle, just like that. How easy was that? And then I am going to pop that stitch saver off the end of the needle. And then your pattern says, and I'm literally, as I do this, y'all, I am just reading from the pattern. So you're going to do exactly what the pattern says, and you're going to slip one to the left-hand needle, and then when with the left-hand needle tip, pick up the strand of yarn between the needles from the back to the front. And this is going to be a tiny bit tight, but don't worry about that. And then you're going to slip the next stitch, and then you are going to pick up that strand in between from the back to the front. And then you're going to slip the next stitch and pick up that strand, and then slip the next stitch and pick up that strand. And then you're just going to slip that last stitch, no need to pick up a strand. So you'll be doing that 10 times and then slipping the last stitch to the left-hand needle. And now you are going to, with your C2, because we're still working with that, you're going to purl 2 together 10 times. I'm going to be purling 2 together 4 times. And you are going to find when you go to do this maneuver that it's a little bit tight. And the easiest way to get into those stitches is to just slide them down so they're all the way on the tip. Sharp needle tips will help here. Of course, it's being difficult because you are watching. There we go. I like how I blame that on you for a second. I'm in there, wrap the yarn around, and pull it through. And now you're going to purl 2 together across just like that. Again, sharp needle tips. Purl 2 together. I'll be doing this 4 times total. This is 3. And then this is 4. The reason this is tight is so that this edge is really tidy and lovely and tight. Just got a little stuck there. I'm purling. And then I am going to purl that last stitch right there. And now those stitches that I had wrapped around the stitch saver, if you were working traditional entrelac, you would have been picking up those stitches along the garter stitch edge. If you decide you don't like working with the stitch saver, you can skip that wrapping around the stitch saver and just pick up stitches and work across them. That is totally up to you. I just found that a lot of people don't like to pick up stitches, and I came up with this alternate way to work entrelac. Now I am going to turn to my right, and the pattern says to purl 11. I am going to be purling 5. And now we are going to introduce a second piece of stitch saver. This stitch saver is going along the edge that you'll be picking up stitches on tier 3 if you were to be working entrelac picking up stitches. So I like to use a separate color of stitch saver just to not get things confused. You can also use the other end of the stitch saver that you've used on tier 1. You just want to make sure that that stitch saver is long enough to do that. So I've wrapped my yarn around the stitch saver, and now I am going to be purling to 1 stitch before the contrast color, that C1 stitch, and I'm going to be purling 2 together. So for you, that'll be purling 10. For me, that was purling 4. And now I'm going to turn my work, and I am going to purl 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to wrap my yarn around my stitch saver again. And again, you can do this the same way as before. If you have the yarn to the front and then bring it to the back, you can wrap it around that stitch saver as you make that turning move, which makes things quite slick. And now I am going to purl 4 and join to that next tier. You're going to continue to work like this across. When you finish this tier, this square right here, you're going to go ahead and slide those next stitches onto your needle. You'll be working the exact same way all the way across until you get to that right leaning triangle at the end. So let's go ahead and look at that in a second. I just want to work a little bit more for those of you that are following along. I think you'll see the maneuvers once you get into them. The only thing that's really different right here is that we're purling, not knitting, once we had those stitches picked up. And you can see how lovely that join right is right there as we are building up our square. And now I'm wrapping around. Remember I said those first 2 stitches I like to work kind of tight, and what that tight does is make those wraps on the stitch saver a little bit tighter and tidier. And now I'm going to purl 2 together, joining, and you're just going to work across until all of those stitches are eaten up. So I have a step out to show you that has 2 squares worked, and it is ready to work that last triangle. So let me go ahead and grab that to show you that. Okay, I'm looking at the wrong side of my fabric right now, and I'm on tier 2. I've worked the triangle, I've worked 2 squares. You're going to end up having 6 squares total. And now I am at the very edge, which is the right leaning triangle. And let's go ahead and do that together. It's the same maneuver for sliding those last stitches onto the right hand needle, just like that. So that's avoiding picking up those stitches. And then I'm going to take that stitch saver off. And then I am going to be slipping those stitches to my left hand needle and picking up the bar of yarn in between as I go. I think it's from the back to the front. Sometimes I use my right needle. I think I wove in that end a little too well. Ignore that, friends. Shouldn't have woven that in. That was me being silly last night. Okay. And then I'm slipping that, picking up that bar from the back to the front, and then sliding those on, picking up that bar from the back to the front, slipping that one on, and then doing that one more time, and making sure not to split the yarn and getting that last stitch on there. There we go. So once I have those on, now I am going to purl 2 together. Your pattern says 10 times. I'm going to do 4 times, and then I am going to purl that last stitch. So I'm going to purl 2 together. Again, if this is tight, you can even put them onto a smaller needle if it's really, really tight and bugging you. That is also an option. I swear these are tighter than before. I was like being so careful to be so tight, wrapping around the stitch saver last night. Just also being sure not to split any yarn while I'm at it. This last one, if it's too tight, just drop that extra stitch you picked up. It's not going to show. I want to talk about why I did that in a second, so remind me if I forget. So I'm going to purl that last stitch, and now I've got those last stitches on my needle, and I'm going to go ahead and work this last triangle by purling. I'm purling 5, you're purling 11. You guys are getting the hang of that right now. Be careful right here. It's really easy when you go to do this to keep knitting that stitch. So make sure to count and make sure that you have the right number of stitches on your needle. Some people place a marker there if they find that they're doing it often. I found that I would get into the groove of just making sure I counted. And now on this row, you're going to be wrapping your yarn around your stitch saver. It's right there, lined up from where you were wrapping it on the previous squares. So you just kind of pull it around a little bit so you can do that. And then I am going to purl to the end. And now I'm going to turn my work. And we are on page 3, tier 2, right leaning, right edge triangle at the very, at the bottom right hand corner of your pattern on page 3. And now I'm going to wrap around my stitch saver and I'm going to turn my work. And now I am going to actually purl 3. You will be purling 9. And then I am going to purl 2 together. And what that's doing is starting to decrease the stitches for the triangle on the edge. The math for entrelac is so fun. It's such a good time with the geometry of this. And then also how it changed when I worked it in garter stitch versus in stockinette stitch, which is how I first started working it. But I decided that I really loved how this yarn looked in garter stitch. So that's what I ended up going for. Swatching is really fun for designs like this when I'm learning something new. Now I just forgot to tell you what I was doing. I purled 2 and then I purled 2 together at that end of the row. And you'll see I'm decreasing the last 2 stitches of the row on wrong side rows, and on right side rows, I am purling across. And what's most important is for you to see what happens at the very end of this row. So I've wrapped my yarn around my stitch saver. I asked him to get out of my way. He's being a camera hog. Purl 2 together right there. And now I am on my last rows. So I'm going to purl 2 right here. And the pattern says that continue as established until you have 1 live C2 stitch remaining, which after I work that purl 2 together, I have right there, and you will be ending with a wrong side row, and you'll have 11 wraps on your stitch saver for that section. Remember that I have 5 right there on my stitch saver, and now you will cut your C2, leaving a 6-inch tail, and you will go on and we'll look at tier 3 together. Okay, under my camera, I have my just finished tier 2 and then a finished tier 3 so that you can see what we're getting ready to do. But I see that I have a difference in these two, and I kind of wanted to show you that. On the sample that I was working on with you all, I had my stitch saver held to the back of my work, which was actually the front of my work. So the stitch saver is facing me right now. And then on this sample I worked, the stitch saver was held to the front of me as I was wrapping around it. And so it's to the back of my work. It doesn't matter which way you have the stitch saver, as long as you are wrapping the way that I showed you, so that that wrap is twisted around the stitch saver so that it's landing with the left leg to the front. So if you're wrapping the way I do for Lola's pickup line, the way I've been showing you, it doesn't matter which side of the work your stitch saver's on. You can decide whichever is more comfortable for you. But what you can see right here is I'm ready to fill in with these squares. And what's on the stitch saver right there is those stitches you'd be picking up for tier 4. And then what is on the needles is the stitches left over from each square of tier 3. And I have sets of 5 right there. You're going to have sets of 11. So what we're going to do right now is start tier 3 together, because what happens with those stitches that are on the stitch saver is a little bit different. and then we will go ahead and move on with the rest of the cowl. Okay, so I have tier 2 facing me with the wrong side row, and I'm going to turn it so I've got the right side facing me, and I'm going to slip that last stitch from the previous triangle to my right hand needle, and then I am going to slide all of those wraps from the stitch saver onto my right hand triangle as well. I love when that happens. You see how the stitch saver popped off, but I was able to catch that last stitch. So this you might want to do at a table. Just be careful when you're using that stitch saver, just in case you have a little poppy moment, just like that. And now I am going to slip this stitch to the left hand needle. And then with the right hand needle, the pattern says to lift up the garter bump, which is this little bump right here, underneath that leg of that stitch from the front to the back, and put it onto the left hand needle. And then you're going to do that maneuver 11 times. I'm going to do it 5 times, where I slip that stitch and then I pick up that little bump right there, and then I put it onto the needle, and then I slip that stitch, and then I pick up that bump and I put it onto the needle, and then I slip that stitch, and then I pick up that bump and put it onto the needle. And then this is the 5th time right here. And then that last stitch on the right hand needle is going to stay there. We're not working with that stitch yet, so don't get confused by that. And now I am going to knit 2 together through the back loop with my C1, and I'm going to do that. I'm doing it 4 times. You're going to be doing it 10 times. And what I'm doing is working that stitch that was wrapped around the stitch saver together with that stitch that I picked up. And when I get to the last pair, I'm knitting it through the front. And what that does is twist things up a little bit and avoid a hole at this spot right here. And now I am going to turn my work, and I am going to knit 4 and then knit 2 together. I'm just getting this stitch saver out of the way because it's bugging me. You're going to knit 10. 1. And that knit 2 together resolves that last stitch from the tier of the previous row. And if things look loosey-goosey, just tight pull on your ends right there, and that will tidy that up. So don't worry too much about that. Look how tidy that edge is once I pulled those up right there. Isn't that stunning? So pretty, so tidy. All right, now I get to grab a piece of stitch saver. If you think there's stitch saver pieces all over my house, you probably wouldn't be wrong. So I've got a piece of stitch saver. I'm using a different color just because I think it makes it a little easier for you all to see. I'm laying it over my working yarn and wrapping it just like we have done before. And now I am going to be knitting 4. You're going to be knitting 10. Just move this out of the way to make it a little cleaner for you to see. And now I am going to slip, slip, knit, and I'm joining together this stitch from tier 3 with that live stitch from tier 2. And now, once we've kind of got those stitches from the stitch saver on the needle, what we're going to be doing going back and forth should be pretty familiar. Now, let's see, I am on row 3, which you'll be knitting 11, I'll be knitting 5. Our magic number is just a little different. And now I'm going to wrap the yarn around the stitch saver. Remember, I said I like to do this better at the end of the row, and then I can turn my work and ask this other piece of stitch saver to get out of the way. And now now I am going to knit across. That first setup square, I think of every tier, that square or triangle is always the one where things are a little like more interesting to maneuver because your stitch saver is kind of hanging free and not anchored yet. And now I am going to slip, slip, knit, and I am just continuing across doing this until all of those stitches are picked up. And then I'm going to do the exact same maneuver with these stitches on the stitch saver, where I slide them onto the left-hand needle and then slip one and pick up that garter bump, slip one and pick up that garter bump. So when you get to that point, you could re-watch what I just showed you for that first square, for that pickup, but really it's the same maneuvers all the way across, and there's nothing new to show you on this tier, but what I can do is show you again what this tier looks like when it is finished, if you would like to see that. All right, Max just said that he really wants to see it. And what I realized is earlier I was talking to you about where the stitch saver was, and I wish I'll make sure to tell you about that point in the video, because now I understand what's happening. Is when I had that stitch saver on the last row, and I could actually show it to you. Do you remember I said, oh, look, that stitch saver's on the front of my work? That is the stitch saver from tier 2, which I had to the back side of my needle. And now when I've finished tier 3, I've got the stitch saver to the back of my work. So again, it's like, it's really up to you where you want that stitch saver to be held. Just be consistent with that as you are working on it. So I have got tier 3 all the way completed. I have worked all the way across tier 3, and it is time for me to work tier 4. And there is only one tiny different maneuver from tier 4 to tier 2. So we'll go over that very quickly, but then you could use the video from tier 2 if you have any questions about working tier 4. Okay, I've got my wrong side facing me right now, and I'm getting ready to work tier 4, which is pretty much the same as tier 2. The only thing is when you go to work that first right-leaning triangle on the left edge, you're just going to knit one stitch and then turn your work. And then you're going to continue as for tier 2, starting with row 2 of that triangle. So that stitch on row 2 is a purl into the front and back of the stitch. And if you remember, I said this is going to be so loosey-goosey, so I kind of wanted to work it with you again, because you might think that your knitting is broken, but I worked that and see how loose it is. I can just pull up on all of my ends and tidy that up really easily. So don't be freaked out on that first purl into the front and back if it's not looking as tidy as you want it to. Pulling up on those ends is going to make everything super pretty there. And now I am ready to work row 3, which is a purl 1, purl 2 together. And then you're just going to be continuing as you did with tier 2. So if you want to go ahead and watch that again as you're working tier 4 for a refresher, go ahead and do that. The next thing that I'm going to show you is tier 5, because we're going to work some German short rows in tier 5 to smooth out those triangles on the top. So let's go ahead and do that next. Okay, underneath the camera, I have tier 5 worked all the way across, and I'm looking at the right side of my entrelac right now, and you can see that I've got double stitches going all the way across. What's happening as we're working tier 5 is we're working tiny little short rows all the way across the top right there to flatten out the top so that we don't have that jagged entrelac edge at the top of the triangle. So instead of going into a square, I've brought it back to a triangle on that top edge. It's really not that hard to do. And I have a step out all ready to go, ready to start working tier 5 so that you can see how to do it when you get to that point. Again, if you want to work a little mini swatch and start smaller, you are certainly welcome to do that. I just got to get a little yarn here. I try to be so prepared for y'all. I've got that last stitch right there on my left-hand needle, and the first thing that I'm going to do is take it and slide it to my right-hand needle, and then I am going to take my stitch saver and slide those 5 wraps onto my right-hand needle as well. Again, you're going to have 11 wraps. And then what I'm going to do is start to put these stitches back onto the left-hand needle, and at the same time pick up that garter bump, same as we did on tier 3. So this should be quite familiar to you at this point. I'm going to go ahead. Oh, I see what I'm doing. I'm using the blunt end of this needle, which makes that a little harder. Pick up that stitch, then slip. It's a good example of why it's easier to do this with a sharp needle tip than a blunt needle tip. Pick up that stitch, slip that, pick up that stitch right there, and then slip that and pick up the last stitch right there. And now remember that that last stitch is going to stay on my right hand needle and not get slipped over. And now I am going to knit 2 together through the back loop. I'll be doing this 4 times. You'll be doing it 10 times. Not a big deal. And then that last 2 stitches, I will be knitting 2 together regularly. And now I am going to turn my work. And now I am going to knit 10. Actually, I'm not knitting 10, I'm knitting 4, you're knitting 10. And then I'm going to knit 2 together, and that resolves that last little stitch on the edge. And now I am going to turn my work to the right side, and I am going to knit 4, you'll be knitting 10, and doing a slip, slip knit. And the double stitches are not starting quite yet, so I'm going to continue working to that point. And now I'm going to turn my work and I'm going to knit to the end. I'm on row 3 right now. And then row 4 has me doing a joining round. So I am going to knit 4, you're knitting 10, and slip, slip, knit. And then I'm going to turn and I'm going to knit to the last stitch. Has anybody noticed I'm not using Stitch Saver on tier 5? We do not need Stitch Saver anymore on tier 5 because there's no more stitches to pick up. So some of you might be like, yes. Or some of you might be like, oh, I love that trick. I want to do it again and again and again. All right, where was I? Started talking. Now I am on, row 5. I got so chatty and I missed something. On row 5, it said knit to the last stitch. So I'm knitting to the last stitch and then turn, right? So I've got that 1 stitch on my right hand needle that I didn't work to. And now it says to work a DS, which is a double stitch, where I'm going to slip the stitch on my left hand needle to my right hand needle purlwise and bring my yarn up and over my needle. This is also called a German short row. I just like to call it a DS for double stitch. And now I am going to knit to the last C1 stitch and work a slip, slip knit right there. And then I am going to knit to the DS. So I'm going to knit right there, and I'm going to stop because I can see my DS that I worked on the previous row. And I'm going to turn my work and I'm going to make a DS. And then I am going to knit to 1 stitch before that contrast color. and I am going to slip, slip, knit, and then I'm going to turn my work, and I am going to knit to the DS from the previous row, turn my work again, make a DS, and then I am going to slip, slip, knit right there. So I repeated that row 6 and 7 until all of those C2 stitches from that triangle right there have been joined, and then I've ended on a right side row with a row 6. And now I'm not going to turn my work. I am going to slide these stitches onto my needle. I'm going to do that same maneuver with the pickup that I already showed you, and then continue working across as we did before. You'll be following the pattern, and as you work this all the way across, you're going to see that what you end up with is those double stitches worked all along the top of tier 5, making that a straight flat row to transition into the garter stitch. So let's talk about what happens right there, because you're going to need to switch your stitch count a little bit, and then we'll be able to talk about finishing the cowl. Okay, we're ready to work the garter transition flat. The reason that you're increasing stitches on the wrong side of this first row is so that the width of your garter stitch matches the width of your entrelac. So I did a bit of math here to make sure that we got that width pretty much the same. And the only like knitting move that I need to show you here is how to pick up and purl, just in case you haven't picked up and purled before. And also as you work across, you'll be working those double stitches as one. So I want to show that to you as well if you've never done that before. I really packed techniques into this kit, didn't I, into this design. So I've got my wrong side facing me right now. I am working with C1 for the rest of this half of the cowl. So I'm not going to be using C2 anymore on this half. And I am going to purl 1 right here. And then the pattern says to pick up and purl. So I'm just going to pick up that stitch right there. And let's see if I can get into it. Yeah. Get it onto my needle and purl that stitch. And then it says to purl 2 stitches. You'll see I'm added double stitch, so I'm going to work those double stitches 1 stitch, and I am working those both together. And then I'm going to pick up and purl again. So I'm just going to pick up that little bump right there. Again, it helps if you have sharp needles. Put that onto the left-hand needle and then purl that stitch. And then you will continue across, working those double stitches across, picking up and purling as the pattern tells you to. Again, I have a different number of stitches on my needles than you have, so my rate of picking up right now is a little bit different. And once you have finished that, then you will be working garter stitch with a little integrated I-cord edge. And once you have your garter stitch worked flat, we'll talk about what happens next. Okay, here's my little garter transition section worked, and I've got my little integrated I-cord edge right there. And this is the spot. So I worked mine about 10.5 inches long. This is the spot that if you want some more width on your cowl, you can work this section longer. And if you watched at the very beginning of the video, I talked about yarn usage to make sure that you have enough for the second half. I had plenty of yarn left over after working these 2 halves. I was able to do all of my swatches for the step outs, and I still have these nice big balls left. So I'm not worried about people running out of yarn if they want to make this section longer to have their cowl have more width to it. And what you could do is work your garter transition section, and before you join into the round, take your stitches and put them onto a piece of scrap yarn, and then use some kind of like one of those little wonder clips or some other kind of pin or something to simulate joining into the round, and put that over your head and see where the line of the split lands for you. Keep in mind that you won't have those inches of the round worked yet, so you're not going to have this kind of buildup of drapey fabric right here, but it'll give you an idea of where's, let me hand find it, like where the split lands and where the fabric lands on your shoulder, to let you know if you want to work a few more inches in that spot or not. I know that all of our shoulders are many different sizes, so I tried to choose like a middle range for that, but that's the place that you would add rows if you want it to be a little bit wider and have that split land in a similar place as mine. Um, After you work the garter transition section, then you're going to work onto working in the round. And what I'm going to do right now is just split these stitches to simulate working in the round so that I can show you how to do that. All right, so you finish the garter transition with a right side row, and you're gonna grab your needle B as you go to work this to join yourself into the round. And the first thing that you wanna do is take that last stitch you worked and put it on to the front needle, so that your last stitch and first stitch are next to each other. And then you're going to go ahead and purl those two stitches together. And then you're going to go ahead and continue to purl all the way around. You've decreased one stitch on this round, so you'll have 118 stitches. I clearly have less than that. And then you're going to go ahead and knit one round, purl one round, and you're going to do that for 6 rounds. And then you're going to cut your C1, attach your C2, and you are going to work rounds 1 and 2 once more. And the reason that you're doing that is when you go to work the garter graft to graft the two halves together, you want to do that graft within the same color. So that ensures that that garter graft will be very smooth and get lost within the stitches. And then finally, the last thing that you're going to do, and I'm looking at the pattern to make sure I get this right, is you're going to remove your end of round marker and you're going to slip the next 59 stitches to the right hand needle, and then place all of your stitches onto a spare piece of stitch saver or needle and set aside. And when you go ahead to do that, you might want to place a marker, because that is your new beginning of the round, so that when you go to line up your two halves and graft them together, the splits are on opposite sides. So don't skip that step of slipping the stitches and then mark that point somehow, so you know that that's where you're doing the graft. At this point, if you have a spare needle, the easiest thing to do is to put those stitches on a spare needle, because then they'll be ready to graft. But if you do it otherwise, make sure to like tie knot, stitch marker. Okay, I said that 5 different ways. You got me. Next thing you're going to do is work your second half. So let's talk about doing that, and then let's talk about what you need to do to finish your roof line. Okay, once you've finished the first half of your cowl, it's time to work the second half. The only difference between working the first half and the second half is you're going to switch which is your C1 and switch is your C2, so that you get this kind of harlequin balance of the roof lines there. You are also going to string on the opposite color of beads, so those beads really pop along the edge if you are using them. And then when you get to that garter stitch section in the round at the end, you're going to continue with the same C1 through 4 repeats of rounds 1 and 2. You're not going to switch to the opposite color. And once you finish that, you are going to end so that you're ready to do a Kitchener graft. And I have a separate video for you for how to do a Kitchener graft. I will link to all of the videos that I've talked about that I have for you in the video notes below, so that you have those when you are ready for them. Some of you know how to do a Kitchener graft. Some of you, sorry, it's a garter stitch graft. I don't call it Kitchener stitch anymore. I just call it a graft or a garter stitch graft. So you'll have the link for that if you need a refresher on how to do that. And when you go to finish, let's just talk about that graft bit a tiny bit more and finishing in the next section. And then I'll say goodbye to you. All right. Once you've finished your two halves, it is time to put them together. What you're going to do is follow the paragraph that is written in the pattern that explains to how to do this maneuver. But if I was to describe it to you, basically you're going to have the second half of your cowl on the outside and the first half of your cowl on the inside. Both of the right sides of those cowls are going to be facing you. So the wrong side of the second half is going to be facing the right side of the first half. And you're just going to be putting the first half up inside of the second half. And then you'll hold those needles parallel to each other. Make sure that your splits are opposite from each other. If you moved the stitches like the pattern tells you to do at the end of the first half of the cowl, you will automatically have the splits on opposite sides of each other. And then you'll go ahead and work that Kitchener graft, garter stitch graft, which is linked below. And after you have done the graft, it is time to block your cowl. I like to weave in my ends before I block my cowl and then trim them afterwards. And that's because sometimes in the blocking process, those ends kind of worm their way back a little bit. So weave in your ends and then go ahead and block your cowl by putting it in some warm water, giving it a good soak, squeezing it out in a towel or two, and then I lay it out flat to dry in a long tube. I don't worry too much about creases on each edge of my tube. You can always kind of steam those out later. I found that this yarn does not crease very much at all. It's got so much drape from that linen and silk. But if you are worried about creases, you can always kind of roll up a towel or two and put them inside of that long tube. So you'll let that long tube sit, let your fabric dry, and then you'll just fold it in half in the middle. And this feels like a good time at the very end of the video. I've avoided taking this off till now because it's kind of funky to put back on again. But I want you to see what it looks like when it's grafted before it's folded. It'll look like this. And right now, I've got the wrong side out of the second half and the right side out of the first half. And that's what it's going to look like when it's laying down flat to graft it. And then when it's done, I can fold it in half so that the second half is on the outside and the first half is on the inside. You could certainly fold it the other way, but I knew I wanted the brown to the top and like a little less of that turquoise. I wanted the turquoise to be more of the accent. So that's going to be up to you which you make color 1 and color 2. Once your fabric is done, I'm like holding it up so you can continue to see it. I could probably get it back on without too much of a trouble. Let's see if she can do it. This thing is like effortless to put on and off. I was so worried it was going to be futzy. The futziest thing is looking in the camera and trying to do it. But there, you just throw it on, kind of pull it down a little bit. You have to pull it down in the back, and you're on and good to go. Now I'm going to futz too much. I find it does better if I just throw it on and I don't try too much to like organize it. I'm very excited to wear this in Spain on my Spain trip in November and have everybody try it on and wear it as well. I'm happy to share it with all of my travelers. We can each have it for like one day of that trip. I can't believe I just said that out loud. Don't hold me to that, everybody. So I hope you enjoy knitting rooflines. I think you can tell that working on the N Club, I get to do some deep dives into new techniques and share them with you. Your support signing up for clubs is what makes it possible for me to really explore things on my needles, to adventure with them, and then share those adventures with you. So I so appreciate you being on this journey with me. Ask any questions. We've got Knit Along Threads and Ravelry and Facebook. I'm always around, and I cannot wait to see your rooflines come off your needles. Happy knitting.